They say a woman's work is never done, but for 72-year-old Elizabeth, her work was just beginning. For 50 years, she was the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the silent pillar of a perfect family. But when her own son and his wife called her a burden in the very home she owned, they made a fatal mistake. They thought she was a relic. They were wrong. She was a weapon. This is the story of how one woman, pushed to the edge, decided to burn her old world to the ground, to build a new one from the ashes. Don't go anywhere. And if you want to see how this story of chilling revenge unfolds, make sure to follow, like, and share. Let us know in the comments what you would do. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single shocking update. The clink of silver against porcelain was the only sound that dared to challenge the oppressive silence in the dining room. It was a sound of wealth, of precision. Each fork, each knife was a relic from a life Elizabeth was beginning to suspect had never really been hers. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the strained faces around it like distorted masks. Her home. Richard had built it, they always said. Richard's house. A monument to his success, here in the manicured heart of Maple Creek, Oregon. But she knew the truth. Richard had designed it, but she had built it. She had filled its echoing spaces with warmth, with life, with the scent of baked bread and the sound of a child's laughter. She had poured her soul into its foundations, and now it felt like a tomb. Across from her, her son David stared at his plate of perfectly roasted chicken as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was a ghost of his father. The same strong jaw, the same dark hair, but with none of the steel in his spine. He was a man made of soft clay, and his wife, Amelia, was the sculptor. Amelia sat to his right, her posture ramrod straight, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of her phone. A small, cruel smile played on her lips as she scrolled, a general in her own private war, fought across comment sections and curated social media feeds. She hadn't looked up in 10 minutes. Her son Leo sat beside Elizabeth. The boy was all angles and awkwardness, his eyes darting between his parents and his grandmother, a silent spectator at an execution he didn't understand. He pushed a stray pea around his plate with his fork, the small scraping sound like a scream in the quiet. Amelia finally sighed, a theatrical put-upon sound that filled the room. She placed her phone face down on the table with a sharp tap. "The market is just impossible," she announced, to no one in particular. "I saw a house today, not half as nice as this one, listed for a price that would make your eyes water. And the property taxes. Don't even get me started." David grunted in what might have been agreement. He still hadn't looked up. "It just makes you think," Amelia continued, her voice light, deceptively casual. She picked up her wineglass, admiring the deep red of the Cabernet. "About expenses. The upkeep on a place this size. It's staggering. The roof will need re-shingling in a few years. The furnace sounded a bit strange last week. It all adds up." Elizabeth felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. This was Amelia's method. A slow, circling approach, like a shark testing the waters before the attack. The passive-aggressive comments had been dripping like a leaky faucet for the past 6 months, ever since Richard's funeral. Little remarks about the grocery bills, the cost of her prescriptions, the way she left the thermostat a degree too high. A death by 1,000 tiny cuts. "The house is in good condition, Amelia," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, though it felt like a stranger's. Richard made sure of that. He used the best materials. Oh, of course he did, Amelia said, her smile widening into something sharp and brilliant. It never reached her eyes. Richard was a genius, a visionary. But even a visionary can't stop inflation, can he? She took a delicate sip of wine. Her eyes, cold and calculating, finally settled on Elizabeth. It's just a lot for David and me to carry. We have Leo's college fund to think about, our own futures. David finally cleared his throat. Amelia, maybe now's not the time. His voice was weak, a plea, not a command. No, David, it is the time, Amelia shot back, her voice losing its saccharine edge and gaining a flinty hardness. She turned her full attention to Elizabeth, her body angled like a predator. The mask was off. You know, Elizabeth, we all love having you here. We do. But let's be honest with ourselves. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her words gather. You eat, you live here, you take up space, but you don't really contribute financially. It's becoming a burden. The words landed, not like a slap, but like a perfectly aimed stiletto, sliding between her ribs, straight into her heart. A burden. After 50 years of service, after raising her son in these halls, after holding Richard's hand as he took his last breath in the master bedroom upstairs, the air left her lungs. She looked at David, a desperate, silent appeal. Say something. Defend me. Be my son. He didn't. He picked up his knife and carefully, meticulously began to cut his chicken into impossibly small pieces. His jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He refused to meet her gaze. His silence was worse than Amelia's cruelty. It was a confirmation, an agreement. She turned her head slightly and saw Leo. The boy looked horrified, his face pale, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. He stared at his mother, his expression a mixture of disbelief and shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but Amelia shot him a look so venomous it could have curdled milk. He snapped his mouth shut, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He, at least, had the decency to be ashamed. A strange thing happened then. The pain, white-hot and searing, receded. The knot in her stomach dissolved. The frantic beating of her heart slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. It was as if the final killing blow had severed something inside her, the last thread of hope, the last vestige of the meek, accommodating woman she had been trained to be. In its place, a profound, chilling calm settled over her. The battle was over. She had lost, or so they thought. She simply looked at Amelia, at the triumphant gleam in her daughter-in-law's eyes, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a concession, and in that moment a decision, fully formed and immutable, crystallized in her mind. They had no idea what they had just done. They had just declared a war they couldn't possibly win. Later, when the house was finally dark and quiet, the silence felt different. It was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. Elizabeth moved through the hallways, a wraith in her own home. Her bare feet made no sound on the polished hardwood floors. She was a ghost, haunting the museum of a life she was no longer sure was hers. The air, thick with the lingering scent of roasted chicken and betrayal, felt heavy in her lungs. She ran a hand along the cool plaster of the wall, a wall she had painted herself, a soft cream colour Richard had chosen without consulting her. Everything had been chosen by Richard. She stopped in front of the gallery wall, a curated collection of smiling faces trapped behind glass. The Hale family. Perfect. Successful. Happy. A lie she had helped build, frame by frame. There was their wedding photo, Richard, handsome and confident in his tuxedo, his arm firmly around her waist, his grip a little too tight. She remembered the photographer telling her to smile, and she had, a wide, bright smile, while Richard's fingers dug into her side, a silent reminder of who was in charge. She had been a prize, a beautiful accessory to his ambition. Another photo, David's first day of kindergarten. He was a small, timid boy, clutching her hand, his eyes wide with fear. She had knelt down, whispering words of encouragement, telling him he was brave. Richard had stood behind them, impatient, checking his watch. "Don't coddle him, Elizabeth," he'd said, his voice sharp. "The world doesn't reward weakness." He had pried David's hand from hers and pushed him gently toward the school doors. She saw it now so clearly. He hadn't been teaching David strength. He had been teaching him to bury his fear, to perform a role, just as she had. He had been moulding their son in his own image, but had only managed to replicate the facade, not the substance. David had learned the shape of strength, but not its core. He was a hollow man. She moved on, her fingers tracing the frame of a family portrait taken just 5 years ago. All 4 of them, dressed in coordinated shades of blue and white, smiling for the camera on a beach in Hawaii. It had been Amelia's idea. "For the Christmas card," she'd chirped. "We need to project success." Elizabeth remembered the tension of that day, the arguments that had happened just moments before the shutter clicked. Amelia berating David for forgetting the expensive sunscreen, Richard quietly furious that the whole vacation was interfering with a lucrative deal he was trying to close over the phone, and she, Elizabeth, playing the peacemaker, smoothing ruffled feathers, forcing smiles onto their faces. Her own plastered on so firmly she felt the muscles in her cheeks ache. She looked at her own eyes in the photograph. They were empty, a beautiful, vacant vessel. Her grief for Richard, which had been a raw, open wound for 6 months, was changing. It was twisting, curdling into something else. Resentment, a cold, hard anger, not just at him, but at herself, for her passivity, for the 50 years she had spent walking on eggshells, shrinking herself to fit into the small, gilded cage he had built for her. He hadn't been a partner. He had been a warden. A charming, sophisticated warden who controlled every aspect of her life, with a velvet glove that hid an iron fist. The finances were a black box to her. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it," he would say, patting her hand. Her opinions on politics, on art, on the books she read, were met with a condescending smile. "That's lovely, dear." He had treated her like a child, a beautiful, simple-minded doll to be displayed on a shelf. And she had let him. She had accepted the comfort of the cage in exchange for her freedom. She drifted into the living room, the grand space dominated by a cold marble fireplace she had never been allowed to use. "Too much soot," Richard had declared. "It'll ruin the furniture." The furniture he had picked out, the art on the walls he had chosen. His presence was everywhere, an indelible stain on the very fabric of the house. And now, Amelia was trying to become the new warden. She could see it with piercing clarity. Amelia didn't just want the house, she craved the status that came with it. She wanted to be the new Mrs. Hale, the matriarch of Maple Creek's most respected family. And Elizabeth, the Dowager Queen, the living reminder of a previous reign, was in the way, an obstacle to be managed, and eventually removed. The burden wasn't financial, it was existential. As long as Elizabeth was here, Amelia could never truly take over. She stood by the large bay window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn, bathed in the pale glow of a street lamp. The silence of the house pressed in on her. She was utterly alone. The realization didn't bring fear, it brought a strange sense of clarity, of focus. For 50 years she had been defined by her relationships. Richard's wife, David's mother. Now, those identities were crumbling, turning to dust, and in the void something new was beginning to form. Something hard and sharp. The woman who had nodded calmly at the dinner table was gone. The ghost in the hallway was fading. Someone else was taking their place. Someone they would not recognize. She turned away from the window, her path now clear. The house was not her tomb. It was her armory. The first hint of dawn was a faint pearlescent grey against the black sky when Elizabeth's alarm vibrated silently under her pillow. She had set it for 4:30 a.m. She slid out of bed, her movements fluid and silent, practiced from years of not wanting to wake Richard. The habits of a lifetime, she thought, could sometimes be useful. The house was still, wrapped in the deep, heavy sleep of a Saturday morning.
David and Amelia, exhausted from their busy week of social climbing and strategic planning, wouldn't stir for hours. Leo, like most teenagers, could probably sleep through an earthquake.
She had a window. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved through the familiar darkness of her bedroom, her hands finding what she needed by touch alone. She pulled a single, medium-sized suitcase from the top of her closet. It was old, but sturdy. She laid it open on the bed and began to pack with a methodical, unhurried efficiency. She wasn't fleeing. She was executing a plan. She chose her clothes carefully. Practical things. A few pairs of comfortable trousers, sensible shoes, sweaters, a simple dark-coloured dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed, wealthy widow from Maple Creek. She was shedding a skin, and she needed a new one. She packed her toiletries, her reading glasses. Then she moved to the small antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. This was the most important part. For years, this desk had been her domain, the one piece of furniture in the house she had chosen for herself. Richard had called it fussy, but had allowed it. Inside, beneath a stack of old stationery and address books, was a large manila envelope. Her hands didn't tremble as she pulled it out. Inside were her personal documents, her birth certificate, her passport, her social security card, and at the very bottom, a thick, folded sheaf of papers with a blue cover, the deed to the house. She unfolded it on the desk, the stiff paper crinkling in the silence. She had been there at the lawyer's office when they had signed the final papers 40 years ago. Richard had been expansive, charming, making jokes with the attorney. She had been a spectator. When it came time to sign, the lawyer had pushed the document towards her. "It will be solely in your name, Mrs. Hale," he'd said. "Richard's instructions. A gesture of his esteem for you." Richard had smiled, a magnanimous, kingly smile. "A man's home is his castle," he'd said, "but my wife is its queen. It is only fitting that she hold the keys to the kingdom." At the time she had been overwhelmed, touched by the romance of it. Now, in the cold light of this new dawn, She saw it for what it was: arrogance, an oversight born of absolute certainty in his own power. He had put the house in her name because it never for 1 second occurred to him that she would ever have the will or the ability to do anything with it. He saw her as an extension of himself, and giving her the deed was like giving his right hand a gift. It was meaningless, because he believed he would always control the hand. It was the single greatest mistake he had ever made, and it was about to become her salvation. She carefully folded the deed and slid it, along with her other documents, into a secure pocket inside the suitcase. She looked around the room one last time, at the photos of a family that was a fiction, at the bed she had shared with a stranger for half a century. She felt no sentimentality, no regret, just a cold, clean sense of purpose. She took one more thing. From her bedside table, she picked up her smartphone, a gift from David and Amelia last Christmas. She looked at it for a long moment, then deliberately placed it back on the nightstand, right in the centre where they couldn't miss it. A silent message: "You don't own me. You don't track me. Not anymore." She zipped the suitcase. It was surprisingly light. She carried it downstairs, her steps still silent on the plush runner of the main staircase. In the front hall, she put the suitcase down and slipped on a coat. She used her own old phone, a simple, non-smart flip phone she kept in her purse for emergencies, to open the Uber app. She'd had Leo show her how to use it months ago, claiming she wanted to be more independent. "That's awesome, Grandma," he'd said, his face lighting up. The car was 7 minutes away. She stood at the front door, her hand on the brass knob. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. She opened the door, stepped out into the chilly, pre-dawn air, and closed it softly behind her. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of the cage door swinging shut, with her on the outside. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver got out and put her single suitcase in the trunk. She slid into the back seat. "Where to, Mom?" he asked. She gave him the address of a clean, anonymous motel on the far side of Portland, an hour's drive away. As the car pulled away from the curb, she finally allowed herself one glance in the side mirror. The house, her house, stood proud and imposing against the lightening sky. It looked like a prison, and she was free. It was almost 10 o'clock when the silence in the house was finally broken by the sound of a bedroom door opening. David stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. "Honey, is the coffee ready?" he called out towards the kitchen. There was no answer. He shuffled downstairs, his brow furrowed. The kitchen was empty. The coffee maker was cold. "Amelia?" Amelia appeared at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a silk robe, her phone already in her hand. "Have you seen your mother? Her bed is made, but she's not in her room." "Probably in the garden," David mumbled, opening the refrigerator. A wave of irritation washed over Amelia's face. "David, it's 50 degrees and damp outside. She's not in the garden. Her car is still in the garage." A flicker of genuine concern, small and fleeting, crossed David's face. "That's odd." "I'll say it's odd," Amelia said, tapping at her phone screen, and checking her location. "You know, on the app we installed." She frowned. "That's weird." It says her phone is upstairs, in her room. They walked back upstairs together and pushed open the door to Elizabeth's room. The room was pristine, the bed perfectly made, and there, sitting in the middle of the nightstand, was her new smartphone. A silent, defiant sentinel.
"What the hell is this?" David said, picking it up.
Amelia's concern was evaporating quickly, replaced by a familiar, simmering annoyance. She left it. She left it on purpose. Where could she have gone? She started opening closet doors, drawers. Her good jewellery is still here, her winter coats. Maybe she just went for a walk, David offered weakly. Without her phone, without her car, at the crack of dawn. Don't be an idiot, David, Amelia snapped. Her mind was racing, running through possibilities, each more inconvenient than the last. This is just like her. So dramatic. She was upset after last night, I could tell. You were a little harsh, Amelia, David said, his voice low. Oh, don't you start. She whirled on him. I said what we were both thinking. Someone had to. The point is, now she's wandered off somewhere to make us feel guilty. She's probably sitting in a KFC 2 towns over, expecting us to come crawling on our knees to apologise. Leo appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. What's going on? Where's Grandma? Your grandmother has decided to play hide and seek, Amelia said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, probably having one of her senior moments. She pulled out her own phone and started tapping furiously. A moment later, a notification pinged on David's phone. He looked down. It was a new message in their family group chat, the one Elizabeth wasn't in. Amelia. Anyone seen Elizabeth? She's done a runner. Left her phone behind. Probably a stunt to get attention after our little chat last night. So incredibly childish. David sighed and began to type a reply, his thumbs clumsy on the screen. We're sure she's fine. She'll turn up when she gets hungry. Let's just give her space. He was already thinking about his golf game that afternoon. Amelia was thinking about the brunch she had planned with her influential friends. The disappearance of Elizabeth was not a crisis. It was a nuisance, an irritating disruption to their weekend plans. They were more annoyed by the inconvenience than worried about her well-being. They saw an old woman's confusion, a petty act of emotional blackmail. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the quiet declaration of war. They assumed she would be back in a day or two, embarrassed and ready to be managed. They had no idea that the woman they thought they knew was already gone, and the woman who was coming for them was someone they couldn't even begin to imagine. The room smelled of bleach and regret. It was a cheap, anonymous space, one of thousands just like it flanking the interstate highways that crisscross the country. The walls were thin, a pale, sickly yellow, and the only art was a faded print of a generic seascape, the kind of ocean you look at but never feel. For a week, this was Elizabeth's world. The buzzing of the mini-fridge was the soundtrack to her days, the blinking red light of the smoke detector, the only star in her night sky. She'd bought a few changes of clothes from a strip mall department store, food from a gas station. She paid in cash. She was a ghost. And in the silence of that room, the rage finally came. It wasn't a sudden explosion, not a wildfire. It was more like a tide, slowly, inexorably rising. For 50 years she had swallowed her words, smoothed over Richard's moods, shrunk herself to fit into the dollhouse he had built for her. She had been the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect silent ornament. And for what? To be called a burden in her own home. To see the son she raised watch, mute and useless, as his wife dismantled her dignity piece by piece. Her first plan, born of pure survival instinct, was simple. The house was in her name. A relic of Richard's monumental ego, a tax strategy he'd explained once in condescendingly simple terms. She would sell it, hire a lawyer from a different state,
Handle it all remotely. Take the money and vanish. Find a small apartment somewhere quiet, maybe near the water, and live out her days in peace. But as the days in the motel bled into one another, the plan felt hollow, insufficient. It was an escape, yes, but it wasn't a reckoning. It was like running from a house fire but never turning around to see what caused the blaze. What had she been living in for half a century? What was the real foundation of that grand house on the hill? It wasn't just wood and stone and Richard's architectural genius. It was built on something else, something she had been willfully blind to. She needed to know, not just for revenge, but for herself, to understand the shape of the cage she had only just realized she'd been in. The answer, she knew, was in the basement, in Richard's workshop, the one place in the entire sprawling house that had been forbidden to her. "A man needs his space, Elizabeth," he'd always said, a placid smile on his handsome face that was not a request but a command. In 50 years she had never once stepped across its threshold. Her opportunity came, as they so often do in the modern world, via social media. She had created a fake Instagram account weeks ago, a ghost profile with no posts and no followers, just to keep a silent, invisible eye on Amelia. Her daughter-in-law's life was an open book of curated perfection, and there it was, posted less than an hour ago. A photo of 2 champagne flutes clinking together, the manicured green of the Maple Creek Country Club in the background. The caption, "Anniversary dinner with my love, #blessed, #country club life." They would be gone for hours. Amelia never rushed a chance to be seen. Elizabeth picked up the cheap motel phone, her hand steady. She called a local taxi service from a town 2 over, asking them to pick her up in 30 minutes. As she waited, she put on the simple grey coat she'd bought. She looked in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the frightened, fading grandmother from that dinner table. Her eyes, which had been clouded with hurt, now held a cool, clear focus. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. Something else was. A cold, hard resolve. The taxi dropped her at the end of her own street. She paid the driver and walked the last block, the evening air crisp and cool. The houses were all lit up, warm squares of light against the deepening twilight. Signs of life. But her house, was dark, a sleeping giant at the top of the hill. It looked different from this angle, imposing and strange. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a target. The old brass key, the one she had used for 50 years, felt foreign in her hand. It slid into the lock with a familiar click that echoed in the profound silence. She pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, unique scent of the house, lemon polish, old books and something else. Richard's cologne, a ghost in the air. She stood motionless in the grand foyer, listening. The only sound was the solemn tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out the long, slow, empty hours of her life here. She didn't look at the family photos on the wall. She didn't glance into the living room, with its perfectly plumped cushions. She was not there for memories. She was a burglar, and she had a single objective: Richard's study. The room was his sanctuary, a shrine to himself,
floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, the faint scent of leather and pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains. He had been a man of obsessive habit and intellectual vanity. The key wouldn't be in a simple lockbox. It would be hidden in plain sight, a little test of intellect for an audience that never existed. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books. Histories, biographies of great men, architectural treatises. And then she saw it. A thick, worn volume, its spine faded. Moby Dick. Richard had quoted it once at some dreadful dinner party. To the last I grapple with thee, from hell's heart I stab at thee. He had loved the drama of it, the story of a man consumed by a singular, destructive obsession. It was so perfectly him. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with a strange, electric anticipation. She pulled the heavy book from the shelf. It felt heavier than it should. She opened the cover. The first few dozen pages were normal. Then she saw it. A perfect square had been cut into the center of the remaining pages, creating a hidden cavity. And nestled inside, on a bed of hollowed-out paper, was a single, ornate iron key. It was old, almost medieval in its design. The locksmith's key, the key to the forbidden room. She closed the book, slid it back into its place on the shelf, and walked out of the study, the cold, heavy key clutched in her palm. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. She walked past the kitchen, past the dining room, to the door that led to the basement. She took a breath and turned the knob. The stairs were steep and unpainted wood, descending into darkness. She found the light switch, the simple pull cord, and a single bare bulb flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. The air grew colder, smelling of damp concrete and sawdust. The main area of the basement was tidy, just as she'd always imagined. Pegboards on the walls held a museum-worthy collection of hand tools, each hanging in its designated neatly outlined spot. Saws, hammers, chisels, all gleaming. A large workbench stood in the centre, its surface clean, except for a set of blueprints held down by a paperweight. This was the image of Richard the world knew, the meticulous craftsman, the builder. But her eyes scanned the far wall. The concrete foundation was smooth and grey, except for one section. It was subtle, but she saw it. A faint, almost invisible seam running from floor to ceiling, the texture of the wall was slightly different there, smoother, as if a panel had been set into the concrete and plastered over. There was no knob, no handle. She ran her hands over the cold surface, pressing. Near the floor, her fingers found a tiny indentation. She pushed hard. There was a low click, and a section of the wall about 3 feet wide swung silently inward on hidden hinges. It opened into absolute blackness. A wave of stale, frigid air washed over her, air that hadn't moved in years. It smelled of dust and decay, of secrets left to rot. Her hand shook as she reached inside, fumbling along the wall, until her fingers found a light switch. She flicked it on. The room was not a workshop. It was a tomb. Soundproof tiles, thick and grey, covered every surface, the walls, the ceiling, even the back of the heavy door. It was a vault designed to keep sound in or out. The room was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and it was filled not with tools, but with the machinery of a different kind of trade. Lining the walls were 4 tall, black, fireproof filing cabinets, their drawers labelled with a small, precise script. On a set of industrial steel shelves above them sat row upon row of identical leather-bound ledgers, their spines stamped with gold-leafed years, 1975, 1976, 1977, all the way to the present. And next to them, dozens of small, circular metal canisters, the kind that held 8mm film reels. This wasn't a place for a hobby. This was an office, a command centre, the hidden heart of Richard Hale's empire. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped inside, the heavy door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud, plunging her into an unnerving, total silence. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the low hum of the fluorescent light overhead and the suffocating weight of 50 years of lies. Her hand, seemingly of its own volition, reached out to the nearest filing cabinet. The label on the top drawer read AC. She pulled the handle. The drawer slid open with a smooth, well-oiled whisper. Inside were dozens of neatly organized manila folders. She pulled one out at random. The name on the tab was Abercrombie, Judge Michael. She opened it. The first page was a police report detailing a drunk driving incident from 1988, a hit and run. The report was marked unresolved, no suspect identified. Tucked behind it was a carbon copy of a check for $10,000, written from one of Richard's business accounts to the investigating officer. And behind that, a handwritten note in Richard's elegant script. M.A. now understands the importance of community harmony. Future cooperation assured. A cold shock, sharp and painful, lanced through her. It was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She shoved the file back into the drawer and slammed it shut, the sound swallowed by the insulated walls. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. She stumbled back and leaned against the shelves, her eyes scanning the titles of the ledgers. They were a library of corruption. She pulled down the ledger for 1995. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. She opened it to a random page. Richard's handwriting was as pristine and controlled as ever. Each entry was a masterpiece of cold, clinical documentation. June 12th, met with T. Patterson. Ongoing SEC investigation into his firm. Standard fraud, easily obfuscated. He provided preliminary architectural contract for the New City Library. A significant gesture. His panic makes him generous. The blueprints for his ruin are now in my possession, should they ever be needed. July 3rd, Councilman Davies's affair with his intern is becoming a liability. Secured photographic evidence via a private contractor. Showed Davies a single print. He wept. The zoning variance for the waterfront project will now proceed without objection. He understands his civic duty. She slammed the book shut. Nausea rose in her throat. Richard. Her Richard. The respected architect, the town benefactor, the man whose hand she had held for half a century. He wasn't a builder. He was a demolitions expert. He was the town's fixer, its puppeteer, its secret cancer. He hadn't built a legacy of beautiful homes. He had built a fortress of blackmail, a web of fear with himself at its centre. His power, his wealth, the respect everyone gave him, it was all a lie, purchased with the silence he sold and the secrets he kept. The 8mm films were probably visual confirmation, his insurance policy. A terrible, horrifying thought began to form in her mind. Amelia. Her desperation for the house. It wasn't about the money. David had a good job. It wasn't about the status. They already had that. It was about this room. It had to be. With a dawning, sickening dread, she went back to the filing cabinets,
to the drawer labelled DF. She flipped through the folders, her heart pounding a sick rhythm against her ribs. And then she saw it. A thick folder, thicker than the others. The tab read, Donnelly Frank, Amelia's father. The brash, backslapping real estate mogul who had always made her skin crawl. She pulled the file out. Her hands were slick with sweat. Inside, it wasn't a DUI or financial fraud. It was a police report from 1982, from a town 100 miles away. An assault charge, a brutal one. The victim was a young woman, a college student. The report detailed a violent attack that had left her hospitalized. The suspect was a 20-year-old Frank Donnelly, but the case was never prosecuted. Lack of evidence, the official file stated. Victim withdrew her statement. Beneath it was Richard's immaculate record-keeping, a cancelled cheque for an astonishing sum of money made out to the victim's family, a deed transfer for a small property into their name, and a single, chilling 8mm film canister labelled simply Donnelly, Confession. Richard hadn't just covered it up. He had recorded the confession. He owned Frank Donnelly. He owned his entire future. And now, Amelia knew. She must have known. Her father on his deathbed must have told her that the proof of his violent past, the secret that could destroy their family's carefully constructed empire, was hidden somewhere inside the walls of Richard Hale's house. Elizabeth sank to the cold floor, the file falling from her lap. The soundproof room pressed in on her. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. Amelia's frantic need to own the house, to get Elizabeth out, to declare her incompetent. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about seizing this arsenal. It was about protecting her own family's monstrous legacy. And more than that, taking possession of the keys to the kingdom. With this material, Amelia wouldn't just be a country club socialite. She would be the new puppeteer of Maple Creek. She would be Richard. The silence of the room was absolute. For a long time, Elizabeth just sat there, adrift in the wreckage of her life. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest. The man she married had never existed. The life she had lived was a carefully constructed stage play. But, through the grief, something else was crystallizing. The cold resolve she'd felt in the motel room was hardening now, turning from ice into steel. Richard had built this empire of secrets. Amelia wanted to inherit it. But they had both made the same mistake. They had underestimated the quiet woman who lived in the heart of their lie. They had seen an ornament, a ghost in the hallway. They had never once thought to look in her eyes and see the fire she was banking. Slowly, Elizabeth got to her feet. She looked at the cabinets, the ledgers, the films. This wasn't just a tomb. It was an armory. And she was the only one with the key. The next morning, she walked into a big box electronics store in a city 30 miles away. The noise and bright lights were a jarring contrast to the silence of the vault. She moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She bought the best portable document scanner they had, small enough to fit in a handbag. Then she went to a cell phone kiosk. "I need a burner phone," she said to the young man behind the counter.
whose name tag read Kyle. Prepaid, untraceable, and I need you to activate it for me. Kyle looked at her, a 72-year-old woman in a simple coat, asking for a burner phone, and his eyebrows shot up. But he just nodded. Sure thing. Cash or card? Cash, Elizabeth said, pulling a roll of bills from her purse. An hour later, she was sitting in a small, quiet coffee shop, the new phone and scanner in her bag. She took a sip of her latte. It tasted like freedom. She pulled out the burner phone, its plastic screen clean and anonymous. She scrolled through the contacts on her old phone, the one she'd kept turned off, and found the number she needed, her grandson, Leo. Her finger hovered over the call button. This was the next step, the one that felt like a betrayal. Leo was the only one who had ever shown her genuine, uncomplicated kindness. He looked at her and saw his grandmother, not an obstacle or a burden. Using him felt like a stain on what she was about to do, but it was the only way. She didn't have the technical skills. She was from a generation of paper and ink, not clouds and encryption. He was her only path forward. She took a deep breath and pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. Grandma? Is that you? This is a weird number. Leo, darling, it's me, she said, her voice smooth, practiced. She had rehearsed this. My old phone is acting up. I bought this cheap one just to make a few calls. Oh, okay, is everything all right? Dad said, well, they're worried.
Where are you? The protective lie came easily. I'm fine, dear. I just needed a little time to myself. I'm staying with an old friend for a bit, but listen, that's not why I'm calling. I need your help with something. Something for your grandfather. There was a pause. For Grandpa Richard? Yes. You know how I've been sorting through his things? I found something wonderful. Boxes and boxes of his old writings. Architectural notes, journals about his design philosophy. It's his legacy, Leo. It can't just sit in a box and turn to dust. I want to preserve it. I want to digitize it. She could hear the shift in his tone, from confused concern to genuine interest. Wow, that's amazing, Grandma. I didn't know he kept journals like that. He was a very private man, Elizabeth said, the irony a bitter taste in her mouth. I bought one of those portable scanner things, but I'm a dinosaur, Leo. I have no idea how to use it properly, or what to do with the files. I want them to be safe, somewhere secure. I was hoping you could walk me through it, maybe over a video call?
Of course. That's a fantastic idea. We can set you up with a cloud storage account, something encrypted so it's totally private and safe. Yeah, absolutely. When do you want to do it?
Would now be too soon?
She asked, her voice deliberately frail.
No, not at all. Let me just finish this class project. Give me an hour. I'll call you back on this number and I'll send you a link for a video chat. We'll get Grandpa Richard's legacy saved, Grandma. I promise.
Thank you, Leo,
she said, and the words were thick with a guilt that was sharp and real.
You're a good boy.
She hung up and stared into her coffee cup. An unwitting accomplice. She was turning her own grandson into a weapon against his parents. The thought was vile. But what was the alternative? To let Amelia win? To let Richard's poison continue to seep through the foundations of the town?
Just with a new hand on the controls? No, the fire had to be put out, even if it meant burning everything to the ground. Richard had built a house of secrets. She would be the one to turn it into a house of truth, one scanned, uploaded, and weaponized page at a time. The thin brown envelope arrived on a Tuesday, an ugly slash of manila against the faded floral bedspread of the motel room. It wasn't delivered by a mailman. A sharp, impersonal knock had echoed through the flimsy door, and a man in a rumpled suit who refused to make eye contact had simply asked, "Elizabeth Hale?" When she'd nodded, he'd thrust the envelope into her hands and walked away, without another word, his job done. His job was to deliver the first volley in a war she hadn't known was formally declared. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, and slid her finger under the flap. The paper inside was crisp, heavy, full of words that were like stones thrown at a window. Emergency petition for conservatorship. Her eyes scanned the lines, the legalese a cold fog. Petitioner, David Hale. Co-petitioner, Amelia Hale. Subject, Elizabeth Hale. Reasoning. The words were a clinical dissection of a person she didn't recognize. Erratic behavior, sudden and unexplained departure from the family home, cognitive decline consistent with age-related dementia, vulnerability to undue influence and financial exploitation. They had taken her quiet escape, her one act of self-preservation, and twisted it into a symptom of madness. They were painting her as a doddering old fool who couldn't be trusted with her own life, let alone her own property. At the bottom of the first page was the name of the law firm they had retained, Sterling and Croft. She knew the name. Everyone in Maple Creek knew the name. Marcus Sterling was the legal equivalent of a shark, a man who smiled while he bled you dry. Specializing in the messy, brutal disputes of the town's wealthiest families, he was the most ruthless lawyer in Maple Creek, and they had aimed him directly at her heart. A tremor started in her hands, a familiar ghost of fear. For a moment she was back in the house on the hill, a shadow in the hallway, voiceless and invisible. They were doing what Richard had always done, defining her, controlling her, erasing her. They wanted to lock her away, not in a gilded cage this time, but in a legal one, where her signature meant nothing, and her voice was a medical symptom. They wanted the house, and they wanted what was inside it. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cheap, anonymous air of the motel. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else was there too, something new. It was the same feeling she'd had in the basement surrounded by Richard's ledgers, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into her bones. It wasn't the heat of rage, it was the opposite. It was a freezing, clarifying calm. They had made a mistake, a profound one. They had looked at her, a 72-year-old woman in a motel room, and seen a victim. They saw a frail, confused mother who had wandered off and needed to be brought back under their control. They saw the woman who had spent 50 years arranging flowers and setting tables, the woman who had absorbed Richard's quiet cruelties and her son's casual neglect without a word of protest. They had no idea that woman was gone. She had died in the silence of that house, in the dust of that hidden workshop. The person holding this petition was someone else entirely. Elizabeth stood up and walked to the small, clouded mirror above the particle board dresser. She looked at her own reflection. The lines on her face were a map of a long, difficult journey. But her eyes were not the eyes of a frightened old woman. They were clear, they were steady, they were cold. This petition wasn't an insult. It was a declaration of war, and she, for the first time in her life, was ready to fight. They thought she was a ghost in the hallway. They were about to find out she was the architect. 2 days later, the knock came again. It wasn't the sharp professional rap of a process server. It was softer, hesitant, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Elizabeth was sitting at the small round table, a new laptop open in front of her, the screen filled with the arcane language of property law and non-profit charters. She had spent 48 hours doing what she had never been allowed to do: learn. The digital ghost of her husband's secrets was safely stored in a cloud, a silent, ticking bomb, and she was meticulously researching the best way to detonate it. She didn't get up immediately. She listened. Another knock, louder this time. "Elizabeth? Mother, it's me. It's Amelia. Please, can we just talk?" The voice was strained, the usual condescending lilt replaced by a thin veneer of civility, stretched taut over a core of raw panic. Elizabeth took a slow, deliberate breath. She closed the laptop, walked to the door, and turned the deadbolt. Amelia stood in the dingy breezeway, looking profoundly out of place. Her tailored blazer, her expensive leather handbag, her perfectly coiffed hair, it all seemed like a costume from another world against the backdrop of peeling paint and stained concrete. Her smile was a painful, forced thing. "Thank God," Amelia breathed, trying to push past Elizabeth into the room. "We've been so worried. David is beside himself, leaving like that with no note. We thought something terrible had happened." Elizabeth didn't move. She held her ground in the doorway, forcing Amelia to remain on the threshold, a supplicant. "I'm fine, Amelia, as you can see." Amelia's eyes darted around the small, bleak room, taking in the unmade bed, the single suitcase, the faint smell of instant coffee. A flicker of disgust quickly masked. "Fine? Elizabeth, this is not fine. You shouldn't be in a place like this. It's not safe. It's not you." "And what am I, Amelia?" Elizabeth's voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a simple question. The question seemed to throw Amelia off balance. You're our mother. You belong at home, with family." "I see," Elizabeth said. "Is that why you and David filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent? Because you were worried?" The smile on Amelia's face froze, then melted away. The mask was gone. Now there was only desperation. That was a precaution, a legal formality. Our lawyer, Mr. Sterling, he said it was the quickest way to ensure you were protected, to protect your assets, to protect you from people who might try to take advantage of you in your state." "My state," Elizabeth repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You mean my state of owning a house that you want?" Amelia flinched as if struck. "No, that's not it at all. We love you. We just want to take care of you." "Look," she said, her voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial, pleading. "Let's stop this. Let's stop all this legal nonsense. It's beneath us. Come home. Or, if you don't want to come home, we can find you a place, a beautiful place, a luxury apartment downtown with a concierge, a pool. We'll set up a monthly stipend, a generous one. You won't have to worry about a thing. Anything you want, Elizabeth, anything. All you have to do is sign the house over to David. And agree to the conservatorship, of course, just for appearances, for your own protection." It was the devil's bargain, laid bare on the stained welcome mat of a second-rate motel. Give us your power, your home, your identity, and we will keep you in a comfortable cage. A newer, shinier cage, but a cage all the same. Elizabeth watched her, a scientist observing a specimen. She saw the frantic pulse in Amelia's throat, the way her manicured fingers twisted the strap of her handbag. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even just about greed anymore. This was about fear. "Why, Amelia?" Elizabeth asked, her voice still unnervingly calm.
Why is the house so important to you? It's our family home. It's where David grew up. It's about the legacy, Amelia said, the words tumbling out too quickly. Richard's legacy. We have to protect the family legacy. There it was, the slip, the confirmation. Legacy. Not the legacy of beautiful architecture or community standing, the real legacy. The one locked away in fireproof cabinets in a soundproofed room, the legacy of secrets and lies. Elizabeth's gaze sharpened, and she saw it then, clear as day, the raw animal fear in Amelia's eyes. She knew. She didn't know the specifics, maybe, but she knew enough. She knew there was something in that house, in that forbidden workshop, that could destroy her. Destroy her father, destroy everything she had clawed and scraped to build. A slow, cold satisfaction spread through Elizabeth's chest. It wasn't joy. It was the grim pleasure of a strategist whose suspicions have just been confirmed by the enemy's own mouth. She held all the cards. She had the truth. And Amelia had only fear. No, Elizabeth said. The word hung in the air between them, small and hard and absolute. Amelia stared, her mouth slightly agape. No? What do you mean, no? I mean no, Elizabeth repeated, her voice as flat and final as a closing door. The apartment, the money, the house, the answer is no. A flicker of pure, undiluted panic flashed across Amelia's face. The composure, the performance, it all crumbled into dust. She looked, for the first time since Elizabeth had known her, truly and utterly defeated. You don't know what you're doing, Amelia whispered, her voice trembling with a rage born of terror. You're an old woman, playing with things you don't understand. Oh, I think I'm just beginning to understand them perfectly, Elizabeth said, and with that she gently but firmly closed the door in her daughter-in-law's face. The click of the deadbolt sounding like the cocking of a gun. The panic in Amelia's eyes was the fuel Elizabeth needed. It burned away the last vestiges of doubt, the last whispers of guilt. This was not about family anymore. It was about justice. A justice that the polite society of Maple Creek had denied for decades. Amelia had tried to bargain with her, to buy her silence. But her silence was no longer for sale. Her life was no longer for sale. She returned to the laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a new, fierce purpose. Her initial research had been broad: lawyers, advocates for the elderly, support groups. Now her search was specific. She wasn't looking for a shield. She was looking for a sword. She typed in keywords: investigative journalism, exposing corruption, non-profit, accountability. Link after link appeared. Most were local news outlets, neutered by advertising dollars from the very people they were supposed to be holding accountable. Others were large national organisations, too big and bureaucratic for her purposes. She needed something with teeth, something nimble, aggressive and fearless. And then she found it. A simple, stark website with a black and white logo, a single word: Veritas. Below it, a tagline: The truth has no agenda. The Veritas Foundation. She clicked, and a history of righteous devastation filled the screen. They had toppled a state senator with evidence of bribery funneled through a shell corporation. They had exposed a chemical company for knowingly poisoning a town's water supply for years,
using leaked internal memos.
They had brought down a revered philanthropic family by proving their fortune was built on decades of labor exploitation. They didn't just report stories, they dismantled empires. They were giant killers. They were perfect. Her heart beat a little faster. This was the instrument. This was the vessel capable of carrying the terrible weight of Richard's secrets and delivering it to the world. She scrolled to their contact page. There were no simple email addresses or phone numbers, only a link to a secure encrypted messaging portal with a warning. We take the security of our sources seriously, so should you. Following the instructions, Elizabeth felt a strange thrill. This was a world she never knew existed, a world of digital cloaks and daggers. She, who had needed Leo to show her how to use a scanner, was now navigating encrypted channels to plot the downfall of her own family. She drafted a short, precise message. I am in possession of 5 decades of documented corruption concerning the elite of Maple Creek, Oregon. The evidence is extensive, implicating prominent figures in financial fraud, blackmail, and a potential cover-up of a violent crime. The source of these documents is the late architect Richard Hale. I do not want to leak this information. I want to create a monument to it. I wish to speak with your director. She hit send, and the message vanished into the ether. For a day there was silence. She began to worry it had been too outlandish, that they had dismissed it as the ramblings of a crank. Then a reply appeared in the secure portal. It was brief and to the point. We have received your message. Await a link for a secure video conference. Director Sarah Chen will be on the call. Be prepared to verify your claims. The link arrived an hour later. Elizabeth clicked it, and her screen split in two. On one side was her own face, illuminated by the laptop's glow in the dim motel room. On the other was a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and dark hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense ponytail. She sat in a Spartan office, a wall of file boxes and whiteboards, covered in frantic scribbles visible behind her. This was Sarah Chen. Mrs. Hale, Sarah said, her voice crisp, devoid of pleasantries. I'm Sarah Chen. You have my attention. You made some very serious claims. Let's not waste time. Tell me what you have. There was no warmth, only a professional, predatory focus. Sarah Chen had seen it all, heard every conspiracy theory and desperate plea. Elizabeth knew she had one chance to be seen not as a hysterical old woman, but as a credible source with an invaluable asset. She took a breath. Ms. Chen, for 50 years, my husband, Richard Hale, was seen as a pillar of this community. The man who built Maple Creek. But that was only half the truth. He was also its fixer. He built beautiful houses for the town's elite, and in exchange for his discretion, they gave him their secrets. He wasn't just an architect of buildings, he was an architect of silence. She explained it all, the forbidden workshop, the hidden room, the ledgers, the files, the 8mm films. She described the systemic nature of the corruption, the quid pro quo that kept the town's engine running on a fuel of hypocrisy and crime. She told her about Amelia's father, his violent assault scrubbed from history by Richard's intervention. She explained that she had digitized everything, every last page and photograph, and secured it in an encrypted cloud server. Sarah listened, motionless, her eyes locked on Elizabeth. Her skepticism was a physical presence, a wall Elizabeth had to break through. It's an extraordinary story, Mrs. Hale, Sarah said when she had finished. It's also, forgive me, completely unbelievable without proof. I understand, Elizabeth said. I'm prepared to give you access to one file. A test case. It details a land deal from 1998. The mayor at the time, a man now considered a town elder, rezoned a protected wetland for a commercial development in exchange for my husband designing and building his son's summer home at no cost. The file contains the falsified environmental reports, the correspondence between the two men, and the ledger entry from my husband logging the pro bono work. The man's son is now a state representative. She sent the file through the secure portal. On the other end of the call, she could see Sarah's eyes scanning something off screen. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then Sarah let out a low whistle. "Jesus," she muttered. She looked back at Elizabeth, and for the first time, the wall of skepticism was gone. In its place was the glint of a hunter who has just caught the scent of a legendary beast. "This is meticulous. He documented everything." "Everything," Elizabeth confirmed.
Now for my proposal.
"I will not sell you these documents. I will not donate them. I am prepared to sell you the entire property at 14 Summit Drive, the house, the land, and its complete contents, including the full digital archive of my husband's secrets, for the symbolic price of $1. Sarah leaned forward, her interest now fully ignited. "For $1? What's the catch, Mrs. Hale? There's always a catch." "One condition," Elizabeth said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You will not simply publish the findings. You will convert the house itself into a permanent public museum and archive. It will be named the Richard Hale House of Truth. The ledgers will be displayed under glass. The files will be accessible to the public. The films will play on a loop. My husband's name will be attached not to the beautiful facades he built, but to the ugly truths he buried. His legacy, the one my daughter-in-law is so desperate to protect, will be one of absolute, unavoidable transparency. That is my price." Sarah Chen was silent for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a demolitions expert contemplating a perfect, beautiful explosion. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice filled with a new and profound respect. "You haven't just brought us a story, you've brought us a goddamn monument. The board will have to approve it, but that's a formality. We'll have our lawyers draft the deed of sale immediately. Welcome to the Veritas Foundation." The War Room was a conference room on the 12th floor of the Sterling and Croft law offices. It was a space designed to intimidate, all dark wood, polished granite, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of a city that, to the men in this room, was little more than a chessboard. David and Amelia sat on one side of the vast table, with the sleek, silver-haired Marcus Sterling at their head. They looked confident, composed, victorious. Elizabeth sat opposite them, alone. She had declined their offer to have court-appointed counsel. She had refused their suggestion to bring a friend for emotional support. She was here on her own terms. The air was thick with condescension. Sterling began, his voice a smooth, deep purr, the sound of expensive litigation. "Elizabeth, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. We all want what's best for you, and we felt it was kinder to resolve this privately, rather than in a cold public courtroom." He slid a thick stack of papers across the granite tabletop. "This is the final conservatorship agreement. It's quite standard. It grants David, as your only son, the authority to manage your estate and make healthcare decisions on your behalf. It ensures your assets are protected and that you receive the highest quality of care." Amelia leaned forward, her face a mask of practiced concern. "It's for the best, Mother. We can finally put this behind us. You can relax. Let us handle the burdens. You've earned your rest." David just nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. He couldn't meet her gaze, He was a passenger in his own life, and his wife was at the wheel, driving them all off a cliff. Elizabeth listened patiently, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She let them finish their performance. She let the weight of their lies settle in the room. They saw her silence as acquiescence, her calmness as the vacant resignation of the senile. They had no idea it was the stillness of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Sterling finally fell silent, a smug, expectant look on his face, Elizabeth did not reach for the papers he had offered. Instead, she opened the simple leather portfolio she had brought with her. She took out a single document, a few pages held together by a staple. She slid it across the table. It came to a stop, directly in front of Marcus Sterling. He picked it up, a slight frown of irritation on his face. He glanced at the first page. His eyes widened slightly. He read it again, more slowly this time. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then a dawning, horrified comprehension. He looked up at Elizabeth, his professional composure completely gone. "What is this?" Amelia demanded, her voice sharp with impatience. Sterling didn't answer. He was still staring at Elizabeth, as if seeing her for the first time. "It's a deed of sale," Elizabeth said, her voice quiet but carrying across the vast table with absolute clarity. "It was notarized and filed with the county clerk's office this morning. The property at 14 Summit Drive, along with all its contents, has been sold." David finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sold? What are you talking about, Mum? You can't sell the house." "Oh, but I could," Elizabeth replied. "Richard may have controlled my life, but he was arrogant. He never imagined I would be capable of doing anything without his permission. So he left the house, solely in my name. A fatal oversight." Amelia snatched the document from Sterling's hand. Her eyes flew across the page. "Sold to the Veritas Foundation? For $1? This is insane! It's not legal!" she shrieked, looking at Sterling for confirmation. Sterling slowly shook his head, his face pale. "It's ironclad, Amelia. A legally executed and recorded sale to a legitimate 501c3 non-profit organisation. It's done." The colour drained from Amelia's face. The carefully constructed mask of the concerned daughter-in-law shattered, revealing the raw, grasping ambition beneath. "The secrets," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "The workshop." Elizabeth gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The house is no longer mine to give," she said calmly, delivering the killing blow, "and therefore no longer my asset for you to manage. Your petition for conservatorship is now, I believe the legal term is, moot." David stared at her, his mouth agape. The web of manipulations, the legal threats, the condescension, it all collapsed around him. He hadn't been fighting his mother. He had been a pawn in a war between his wife and the quiet woman who had poured his cereal every morning of his childhood. A woman he had never known, never truly seen. And he had backed the wrong side. He finally understood that he had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered, not by the ruthless lawyer or his ambitious wife, but by the mother he had long ago dismissed as a relic of the past. The ghost in the hallway had just burned the whole house down, and them with it. 3 months can feel like a lifetime, or no time at all. For Maple Creek it was the former. The quiet, leafy streets of the town had transformed. They now hummed with a different kind of energy, a low-frequency vibration of scandal and morbid curiosity. The source of that energy was the old Hale House, once a symbol of quiet, aspirational wealth,
now the epicenter of an earthquake that had fractured the town's very foundation. Today, the hum was a roar. News vans from Portland, Seattle, even a few national outlets were parked bumper to bumper down the lane, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky like metallic sunflowers seeking a signal. A crowd of locals and out-of-towners pressed against temporary police barricades, their faces a mixture of glee, shock, and a kind of ravenous hunger for the drama unfolding within. The house itself looked the same yet entirely different. A tasteful, professionally made banner hung over the porch where Elizabeth had once grown petunias. It read, "The Richard Hale House of Truth, an exhibit." A reporter with perfect hair and a microphone stood in front of the house, her face glowing in the light of the camera. "We are live from Maple Creek, a town reeling from revelations that have torn through its most elite circles," she said, her voice crisp and urgent. What was once the private residence of respected architect Richard Hale has been transformed by the Veritas Foundation into a public museum, a monument to the secrets he kept. We're told the exhibits inside are explosive. The doors have just opened, and people are now making their way inside to see for themselves the architecture of ruin left behind by one of this town's most powerful men. Inside, the scent of fresh paint and lemon-scented cleaner had replaced the faint, lingering smell of Amelia's potpourri. The grand foyer, where David and Amelia had once dreamed of hosting elegant parties, was now a ticketing area. But beyond it, the house was a tomb, its walls lined not with family photos, but with professionally mounted enlarged documents that served as epitaphs for the reputations of the living. The living room, once a shrine to Amelia's impeccable taste, was the first gallery. The plush sofas and Persian rugs were gone, replaced by stark museum-style lighting that illuminated the damning evidence. Under a long pane of protective glass lay the first of Richard's ledgers, open to a page that had already become infamous in the local news. The heading was Project Nightingale. Below it, in Richard's precise architectural script, were dates, names and figures. It detailed with chilling banality the payments made to a private investigator to gather blackmail material on a city councilman who had opposed one of Richard's development projects. Next to the ledger, an enlarged photograph showed the councilman in a compromising position, a grainy black and white image that had ended his career and his marriage just 2 weeks prior. A low whistle came from a man in a plaid shirt, staring at the display. "Jesus," he muttered to his wife. "Richard Hale did that. He used to coach my kids' little league team." His wife shook her head, her eyes wide. "You never know who people really are, do you?" The tour of destruction continued into the dining room, where the long mahogany table once stood. A series of television screens played 8mm films on a silent loop. The footage was grainy, flickering, and utterly horrifying. One screen showed a local surgeon, a pillar of the community, stumbling out of a bar and getting into his car. The next scene, clearly filmed from a distance, showed his car swerving and hitting a parked vehicle before speeding away. Another clip showed Richard Hale meeting the surgeon at a diner 2 days later, a manila envelope sliding across the table. A placard below the screen explained that the owner of the damaged car had received a generous anonymous cash settlement the following day, and the police report had mysteriously vanished. Visitors moved through the rooms in a state of stunned silence, punctuated by gasps and whispered conversations. They were ghosts at a feast of secrets.
"Look at this," a woman whispered, pointing to a wall in the den. "The school board president. Says here Richard funneled money to his campaign to ensure the contract for the new high school went to his preferred construction company, one that used substandard materials." A friend leaned in closer to read the fine print on a photocopied bank statement. "My God, my son goes to that school." But the heart of the exhibit, the black, beating core of the whole rotten edifice, was in what used to be the master bedroom. The Veritas Foundation had titled this room The Price of Ambition. It was dedicated to a single story, the story of the Sterling family. One entire wall was a timeline, beginning with a smiling photograph of Amelia's father, Mr. Sterling, accepting a Businessman of the Year award a decade ago. It followed his rise, his acquisitions, his carefully curated public image, and then it came to a single terrible night. The centerpiece of the exhibit was Richard's file on him. It was laid out, piece by devastating piece, under glass, a copy of a police report, heavily redacted, detailing a call to a hotel room, a preliminary charge of aggravated assault, and then Richard's ledger entry. Sterling matter, resolution, $50,000. Below it were copies of cancelled checks to a young woman, a hotel security guard, and a consulting fee to a contact within the police department. Most damning of all was a typed, unsigned statement from the victim, recanting her entire story, her words hollow and lifeless on the page. A small screen next to the display played a recent news report. It showed Mr. Sterling, his face ashen, pushing through a crowd of reporters, his lawyer shouting, "No comment," as the headline flashed on the bottom of the screen. Prominent businessman investigated as decades-old assault case is reopened. The final piece on the wall was a single, enlarged text message, retrieved from Amelia's phone records, which the Foundation had legally acquired. It was from Amelia to her father, sent the day after Elizabeth left. "She's gone. We need to get control of the house, now, before she does something crazy. Everything is in there. Everything." A woman standing in front of the display turned to her husband. "So that's what this was all about," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "It wasn't about caring for an old woman. They just wanted to keep the lid on this." The house, once a symbol of their future, of their aspirations, had become a public monument to their greed and their disgrace. It was a museum of their downfall. Miles away from the spectacle, in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, smelling of stale coffee and curdled hope, David Hale sat on a lumpy sofa, watching the same news reports on a cheap television. The screen showed the house, their house, swarmed by strangers. Amelia was in the small kitchenette, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her knuckles white as she gripped the chipped Formica countertop. "Turn it off, David," she hissed. "I can't listen to it anymore." "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked, his voice hollow, not really speaking to her. He was staring at the screen, at the face of the reporter standing on what used to be his front lawn. "We can't go anywhere." "I told you," Amelia spat, whirling around to face him. Her face was gaunt, her expensive clothes hanging off her as if they belonged to someone else. "I told you we should have been more aggressive. We should have had her declared incompetent the moment she walked out that door. We were too soft." David let out a short, bitter laugh. "Soft? You wanted to throw my mother into a home and steal her house to protect your criminal father, and you call that soft?" "It was our house," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It was supposed to be ours. Your father promised it to you. She had no right." "She had every right," David said, finally looking away from the screen to meet her furious gaze. "Her name was on the deed. That's the only thing that ever mattered. Not promises, not what we deserved, just a piece of paper. A piece of paper your mother-in-law was smart enough to hold on to." The fight went out of Amelia. She slumped against the counter, burying her face in her hands. "My father called," she whispered. "The board has forced him to resign. They're talking about clawbacks. We're going to have nothing. Less than nothing. We're ruined." "We've been ruined since the day she walked out," David said flatly. "We just didn't know it yet." Later that afternoon he had to go out. They were out of milk and coffee and everything else. The small fund of money they had was dwindling, and the prospect of finding a job in Maple Creek
or anywhere else was 0. Their names were poison.
He put on a baseball cap and sunglasses, a useless disguise. The moment he stepped into the local grocery store, the whispering started. It was like a change in the air pressure. Conversations stopped, then restarted in lower tones. Heads turned. People who had known him his whole life. People who had come to his father's funeral and clapped him on the back, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They moved their carts to the other side of the aisle to avoid him. At the checkout, the young cashier, a girl who used to be in his son Leo's class, wouldn't meet his eye. She scanned his items in silence, her movements stiff and angry. "That'll be $12.50, she said, her voice cold. He handed her a 20. As she gave him his change, her fingers brushed his, and she flinched, pulling her hand back as if he were diseased. He walked out of the store, the plastic bag crinkling in his fist. He got into his modest second-hand car. The luxury SUV had been repossessed weeks ago, and just sat there for a long moment, the sunglasses still on his face. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the parking lot on him. He was trapped. They both were. Prisoners in a town that was once their kingdom, sentenced to a lifetime of public shame by the quiet, frail old woman they had so badly underestimated. His mother hadn't just taken the house from them. She had taken their entire world, dismantled it piece by piece, and put its ugliness on display for everyone to see. Chapter 2. Hundreds of miles away, the Pacific Ocean sighed against a rocky shoreline. The air was cool and tasted of salt and kelp. In a small second-floor apartment overlooking the water, Elizabeth Hale clicked the trackpad on her laptop. The news report from Maple Creek, with its shouting reporters and damning headlines, vanished, replaced by the calming blue-green image of her screensaver, a simple photograph of a seagull in flight. She closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. The apartment was furnished with simple second-hand pieces, a comfortable, slightly worn armchair, a small wooden table, a single bookshelf holding a half-dozen paperbacks. There were no ghosts here. No memories of a life lived as a decorative object. The only history in this room was the one she had started creating 3 months ago. For a moment she felt nothing. The burning, white-hot rage that had fueled her for weeks, the icy resolve that had guided her through the clandestine meetings and legal depositions, had finally burned itself out. In its place was not triumph, not joy, but a vast, hollow quiet, an emptiness. It was the feeling of a battlefield after the war is over, the deafening silence where the cannons used to roar. She had won. She had taken everything from them, just as they had planned to take everything from her. She had exposed the rot at the core of her marriage, at the core of the town she had called home for 50 years. She had demolished their future. And now what? She stood up and walked to the sliding glass door that led to a small balcony. She slid it open, and the sound of the waves rushed in, a steady, indifferent rhythm. She breathed in deeply. The salt air was clean. It didn't smell of secrets or lies. She thought of David's face in that lawyer's office, the shock, the dawning, horrified comprehension. She thought of Amelia's mask of superiority crumbling into dust. She felt a pang, not of guilt, but of a deep, profound sorrow. A sorrow for the son she had raised, the boy who had become a man so terrified of his own shadow that he had let his wife try to discard his own mother. A sorrow for the family that had never really been a family at all,
Her phone, an untraceable burner she'd bought with cash, buzzed on the table. It was the first time it had made a sound in a week. She hesitated, her heart giving a small, nervous flutter. No one had this number, no one except the lawyers at the Veritas Foundation and Leo. She walked back inside and picked it up. A new text message was on the screen. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but the words were unmistakable. I saw the news. I think I understand now. All of it. I'm proud of you, Grandma. You're free. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped her eye and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of happiness. It was a tear of release. Leo understood. The one person whose opinion, whose love she still cherished, understood. He didn't see a monster. He saw a survivor. She had been forced to burn down her entire world. She had immolated her past, her family, her home, turning it all to ash and smoke. She had sacrificed her son and her legacy on the altar of her own liberation. It was a terrible price to pay. She wiped the tear from her cheek with the back of her hand and looked back out at the ocean. The water stretched to the horizon, vast, grey and powerful. It didn't care about the Hale family, or Maple Creek, or the Museum of Secrets. It was magnificent in its indifference. It simply was. For 50 years she had been Richard's wife. For 25 years she had been David's mother. For 5 years she had been Amelia's obstacle. She had been defined by her relationships to other people, a satellite orbiting their suns. Now, standing on her small balcony, with the salt spray on her face and the sound of the endless ocean in her ears, she was just Elizabeth. For the first time in her entire adult life, she belonged completely to herself. The feeling was terrifying. And it was glorious. Elizabeth's story is one of silent endurance and loud liberation. It reminds us that the quietest people often have the most powerful truths to tell. What invisible cages do we build for others or for ourselves? And what does it truly mean to be free? Share your thoughts on what real freedom looks like in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story.